2020 has been a giant year for the technology industry, more specifically talking about the PC hardware and gaming industry. This year we have seen lots of next-gen hardware come out, with still yet more to come. So some of the biggest launches have been the release of Ampere architecture from NVIDIA, releasing their RTX 3000 series graphics cards, along with the highly anticipated release of RTX 3000 series graphics cards. We also have GPU offerings from AMD featuring RDNA 2 graphics cards. AMD also bringing major pressure on Intel, getting ready to release their Zen 3 Ryzen 5000 CPUs. Lastly, we did get the release of the pretty extensive lineup from Intel, including their 10th generation Core H series processors. So with this plethora of new hardware that's come out, what are PC hardware enthusiasts and gamers going to be building as far as form factor goes in their next PC? Hey, what's up guys? Jake Verdon Tech here, and that is the topic today. We're going to be talking about ITX small form factor PCs versus their counterpart, which is mid-tower and full-tower PCs. We're going to be weighing out the pros and cons of each option and see what might be the best fit for your next build, especially with all this new hardware coming out here in 2020. So before we dive into the pros and cons, we're just going to kind of talk about the subject in general. And from what I've kind of gathered last year and going into this year is ITX builds have become very popular, probably more popular than ever. I definitely noticed the popularity from a lot of my YouTube videos involving a ITX build in the N-Case M1, as I got really good feedback on those and I got lots of views and other people commenting saying they were going to be doing a build in a small form factor case or the N-Case M1 like I had in that video. So there's definitely high interest in small form factor builds. Now this could have stemmed from a number of things. We do have hardware that is getting smaller and faster, which can obviously go much easier into an ITX build. So we're getting much more performance and smaller hardware, which is pretty common as technology advances. Another thing that might have caused this is the case manufacturing industry, as we've had a lot of manufacturers come out with really cool ITX form factor cases. So now comparing and contrasting these two types of PC builds, we're going to start off with the ITX PC and what are the pros and cons of it. So we'll start with the obvious one. ITX PCs, they're just smaller. It's a small form factor build, and in many cases it can be much more convenient in your desk setup, or if you tend to move the PC a lot, or if you're doing LAN parties and stuff like that, it's much easier to manage than a mid or full tower PC build. And from some of this footage, you guys can clearly see that a ITX build like my N-Case M1 build can just about fit inside of the full tower N2719 from Fantex. So it's a huge difference in size going from even a mid tower to ITX. So another pro talking about ITX builds, and this goes along with the size, is the amount of performance you can pack into a small form factor PC these days is quite substantial and is about the same amount of power you can fit into a mid or full tower PC. Now you are limited to one graphics card, but what I meant by that is I can fit the same hardware that I have in my full tower PC right now into the ITX form factor PC, minus the cooling components. So right now, if you were to build a mid or full tower PC and you put a RTX 3080 in it and a 10th gen Intel or 3000 series Ryzen CPU, minus the form factor of the motherboard, you can put those components into a mini ITX PC, usually no problem. And I've even seen some videos where guys are putting RTX 3090s into some ITX cases. So they are much smaller, but they still can pack a lot of performance into them. So talking about the cons of ITX PCs, which it kind of does come with quite a few, even though they're awesome little machines, and there's a lot of really cool custom ITX PCs that are out there that people have built. Unfortunately, like I said, it does have some cons to it. So even though I mentioned that you can usually fit the same amount of performance from a mid or full tower PC build into an ITX PC build, that's not always the case in terms of maybe dual graphics cards. If you're running, SLI dual graphics card, you can't do that on an ITX motherboard because you only have one PCIe slot. Another thing is with the lack of PCIe slots, you also don't have room to put any sort of capture card in there or stuff like that. So you are limited just to the one PCIe slot, which is more than likely going to be for your graphics card. So another thing as far as hardware compatibility goes is the amount of space you have for hard drives. So if you are somebody that has a editing rig and you store lots of footage on your PC, you're not going to have a whole lot of space in that ITX form factor case for extra hard drives. So that's definitely something to consider. A lot of ITX boards are getting really good about having dual M.2 slots. The ASRock Phantom Gaming motherboard that I have in my Ncase M1 build does have two M.2 slots on it, which comes in handy quite a bit. But if you're looking to get maybe terabytes and terabytes of hard disk storage, it's probably not going to happen in a small form factor build. So the next con I have listed for ITX PCs, which is more geared towards beginner builders and beginner PC enthusiasts, is that ITX builds are a little bit trickier to build in, basically because of the fact that you have less room to work with. You have less room to actually work and fit the components inside, along with the cable management. But there are exceptions to that, like the Ncase M1, which I found to be very easy to build in, even for somebody that is newer to PC building. The case is just so well laid out, I feel like a beginner wouldn't have an issue building in it. So talking about less room in ITX PCs, that leads us into our next con, which is less room for custom water cooling. Now, there are lots and lots of cool builds on social media and stuff of people water cooling small form factor PCs, which look awesome, and they're great little machines, but they does come with a huge challenge to water cool them and getting the thermals to the appropriate temperature to actually run. So the last con point of ITX PCs that we're going to talk about is the lack of expandability in these systems. Like we mentioned earlier, you don't have much room to expand your storage like you do in a mid or full tower build. Also, as far as RAM goes, you only have 2 DIMM slots typically on an ITX motherboard, so you're kind of limited on the amount of RAM you can add to your system. And obviously with a smaller motherboard too and less PCIe lanes, you're not going to be able to add any other PCIe devices like another graphics card, maybe a capture card, or anything else like that. So you are kind of limited there. So talking about the pros of mid and full tower PC builds, which is kind of the alternate of some of the cons we looked at for ITX PCs. So starting off with the pros of larger form factor PCs, we're going to talk about expandability, which is what the ITX PC kind of lacks. Generally, when you build in a mid or full tower PC case, you have lots of room to expand in the future. So you might start off with a certain amount of RAM, a certain amount of storage, but that can always be upped mainly due to the size of the motherboard and the size of the case that you're working with. And having additional PCIe lanes, you can always add more devices on there as well. So another pro of having a larger form factor build is the amount of space that you have for custom cooling. So if you're a serious overclocker and you're trying to get the most amount of cooling possible, a custom loop is no problem in a mid or full tower case. Some are a bit easier to build in than others, but for the most part you can fit more radiators, more fans, and in many cases you have the opportunity to expand your cooling in the future. So going over the cons of mid and full tower PCs, the main thing is they're just big. They're hard to fit in your setup sometimes, especially if your desk isn't quite situated right to have it on top of the desk, and a lot of times that results in people putting their PCs on the floor, which definitely isn't recommended by many people, including myself. So they can be a real pain to fit into your setup. Also coming with that size is they're just a pain to move. Like this N2719 build behind me is extremely large and heavy, and to clean it or to move it anywhere else is a real process, and I try to avoid it at all costs. Large form factor PCs like this one, or even mid tower case builds, are definitely not something you want to bring to your friend's LAN party. So that wraps up the pro and con comparison between small form factor builds and large form factor builds. Some final things to consider. I think it really just comes down to the build and what you want out of your build. If you're someone like me whose favorite component is the case, So a lot of times if you see a case that's maybe an ITX rig or a mid or full tower case, that'll kind of steer the direction of your build and you'll go from there. I think an ITX PC is an awesome way to go as long as it satisfies your needs as far as performance goes. But if you're looking to expand in the future and possibly build a pretty extensive custom water-cooled loop or more hard drives in the future, I think a mid or full tower case is probably a good way to go. So that is going to wrap up this video, guys. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this enlightened you a little bit on the pros and cons between small form factor PC builds and large mid tower and full tower PC builds. Let me know in the comments what your favorite form factor PC is. One PC form factor we didn't talk about is like micro ATX size PCs, which is kind of that fine line in the middle between mid tower and full tower and ITX, which might be very suitable for some of you guys watching this video. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to give us a thumbs up, and if you want to see more tech related videos like this one, be sure to subscribe. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.